Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the LAI COVID-19 Cross-Cutting Trends Towards a New Reality. We'll start in just a few seconds. We're letting everybody log in right now. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm Sheila Harris, President of LAI International, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to our webinar on COVID-19 cross-cutting trends. It's a continuation of a discussion we started last week, and we are very thankful for our friends at EPS, Economic and Planning Systems in California, who are members and also really willing and able to share their great research that they've done on this effort. They will be diving a little bit more into the topic and hope to have a lot more discussion than we did in our previous meeting. I'd also like to thank Kathy King, Bill Adams, Todd Cabanban, Sheila Hamilton, and the many others that helped put this presentation together. We will be taking questions, so please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Type in your questions as they arrive, and we will try to answer them in order of presentation. If you missed our first session, you can find it at LAI.org. That's where we keep all the information about our webinars, as well as all the wonderful offerings that other chapters are providing to everyone in our little LAI world. And with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Jim Musbach, who will introduce the rest of the panel members. Jim?
Thank you, Sheila. I'm Jim Musbach. I'm a senior principal with EPS and a long-time member of LAI and the Golden Gate chapter. And as Sheila mentioned, this is the second part of a two-part webinar series looking at the implications of the COVID pandemic on our economy, social and economic status in our U.S. and ultimately what it has, how it plays out in the real estate sector. We went through the broader implications in the last presentation, and this time we're going to be drilling down more into specific sectors of the real estate economy and giving you our perspective on what we've been able to learn and to glean and to foresee from where we stand right now in the middle of this whole thing. I should also mention that the unrest that's happened in the last week, this is all, since the first presentation that we made, has some implications certainly for retail and restaurant and some other sectors of the real estate industry, and perhaps even the likelihood that we have a second wave of the coronavirus. So we'll talk about that a little bit in the context of the presentation. As Sheila mentioned, we would like to make this as interactive as we can. So if people can use the Q&A function to post their questions, we will take a pause from time to time and try to respond to those as we go through this. And love to get everybody's thoughts and input on this because there's just so much uncertainty and so many different dimensions of this for all of us to consider. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my two colleagues, Jason Moody and David Zender, who are the principal researchers on this and will be the principal presenters as we go through this presentation.
Thank you, Jim. Hello, and my name is David Zender. I'm a managing principal with Economic and Planning Systems. And I would like to thank LAI for the opportunity to really engage on this topic. We're very fortunate to have a number of clients that are analyzing trends across the country, looking at major metros as well as secondary and tertiary, and looking at the evaluating the effects of pandemic on the outlook. And we're able to parlay much of that research into this presentation for LAI and customize it to address LAI's membership. The membership of LAI is, of course, very diverse and cuts across a wide number of disciplines. And so we're really, in this case, appealing to that sentiment, and we do hope to get a lot of your questions as we go through this. So as we take you through the presentation, I'm going to give you a quick recap in terms of where we were last week. Last week, we analyzed really the structural drivers of the pandemic. We spent some time thinking about the overall growth of the economy prior to the pandemic, some of the trends that we've seen that were leading into the pandemic, including urbanization and bifurcation of society in terms of wage rates and living conditions and so forth, some of which play into what we're seeing in the way of the protest movements we're looking at now. We've had an endemic weakness in many households' financial conditions that was laid bare by the onset of the virus. And that weakness so far has been evaded, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But the chickens will come home to roost if we don't get this economy back on track fairly quickly. So I'm going to take you through the residential aspects of the outlook, really thinking about connections and patterns and dynamics, probably more than really looking at trying to peg a specific prediction per se. Then my colleague Jason Moody, also managing principal here at EPS, will take you through the office, flex, retail, and hospitality aspects. We'll jump back into the industrial outlook, which is very interesting right now, and then hopefully engage both Sheila and Jim and the rest of you in some discussion of what we see coming out of this. So just to take you back a week, and it seems like it's been a really long week, the basic configuration of the stages of recovery is shown here. And this is really a simplification of the multiple outlooks that we presented last week. We presented a derivative of McKinsey's research showing about 9 different recovery scenarios. We've sort of collapsed those recovery scenarios into a single graphic here. We find ourselves now in the containment and re-entry period in the second quarter of the year. And this is the critical time, effectively, where we will see how the patterns begin to change and what the sort of re-emergence into the new normal will look like. And much depends, obviously, on the upcoming recovery and cure phase. So we have a lot of unknowns facing us right now. And it'll be interesting to see sort of how the process goes. We talked about the notion last time of a V curve versus a U curve, and then there was a notion also of an L curve, basically representing a shift in demand downward. And now there's, I think the latest term is the flying W. So we have a lot of creativity in terms of our nomenclature, but the flying W is sort of represented by the red curve on the bottom, where initial improvements over the summer perhaps are taken back a bit through the winter. There is talk of potential second virus wave on the horizon, and then moving into next year, it's possible we could see into the summer there more of a substantial recovery. So that's some of the prognostication that's occurring out there. And in the meantime, we're watching the data as closely as possible to sort of gauge consumer behavior. This is real-time big data collected by Google. If you have your locational settings on your phone turned on, you're going to be basically tracked by this data. And this is a really helpful resource that kind of gives you a window as to what's going on in the current day. And what we're seeing is really, a great flocking to the outdoors. As you can see, the green bar, or the green line on the top shows you sort of, we're really moving out into parks and open space as sort of our primary means of entertainment and leisure at this stage. What else really is there to do? On the other hand, we are also seeing some recovery in some of the other areas. For example, grocery never went away. We can see that that's sort of depressed, but it's still close to normal. But when we get into workspace, visits and use of transit, those are lagging way behind. Workspace, of course, we'll talk about today. Transit is going to be another real challenge, and I think it does go right to the notion of our transit-oriented development concepts, which have formed a basis for much of our urban renaissance. And I think it's worth a closer look to think about how that trend or trends may change going forward. In addition, we're sort of interested in this familiar Venn diagram. I'm sure you've all seen a variation on this theme, but basically live, work, play is one way to think of it. We've arranged this as home, work, and the third place being community. And I think what's interesting is we're really re-examining the relationships between all of these circles. All of the intersects are now up for further investigation and thought in terms of how we live our lives. So obviously home and work has become blurred for many of us. This is having societal impacts, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But it is interesting that there is discussion of upticks in divorce rates and other sort of phenomena that may come out of these shelter-in-place trends that may drive housing demand and other trends. So it's worth thinking about how we spend our time and how these different aspects of our lives may have changed in a permanent way coming out of this. So again, last week we spent a bit of time sort of setting the table for discussion of short-term versus structural effects. And this sort of lays out the quick look across the land use sectors. And we're going to come back to this later in the presentation, but effectively this gives you a glimpse as to some of the elements of the outlook that we're seeing. And in particular, we think that there is some real questions around multifamily residential in terms of its ability to hold on. We're showing a tacitly positive outlook there, but I think that's a really critical sector that we're going to have to dive into a little bit more. Another, there's some really interesting things happening out there in terms of discretionary retail and other sectors, and we'll come back to those in more detail as we move through this and at the end. So I'm going to take you through some residential observations here. And so this just gives you a sense of the multifamily environment pre-pandemic. And in multifamily, we were really seeing a fairly strong sector, and not just multifamily, but single family as well. Heading into the pandemic, we were positioning many of our projects to include multifamily as sort of a financial driver of many mixed use concepts. And so residential multifamily had really emerged as a solidifying and stabilizing force as we look at emerging projects, especially in our urban cores. You can see that starting in about 2016, we really began to hit a little bit more of a stride. There's not a strong growth trend here, but you can see at that time, 263,000 units delivered and that number is basically held strong with some softening occurring in sort of high-end markets, and those may be vulnerable going forward. Here you can see some interesting trend lines in terms of the Case-Shiller price index. And you can see, of course, the big run up prior to the great financial crisis, and then the precipitous drop, and then a recovery, and then we're back on a strong price growth curve. And then you can also see the deleterious effect that the price run up had on home ownership rates. However, starting in about 2017, home ownership again started to track upward, and we found ourselves pre-pandemic in overall a fairly strong fundamental situation here, with growth tracking in terms of both home ownership and prices. Now, of course, that can't continue forever. We are seeing some real issues in terms of affordability among certain households, especially in the service sector. So as we think about trouble on the horizon, so to speak, it's worth noting the New York Times reported 2 or 3 days ago, 25% of tenants are paying more than half of their pre-tax income on their rents. And so obviously that is just not a sustainable situation going forward. And as the pandemic hits, we see that in April, about 25% of tenants were not paying full rent. In May, that number jumped to 31%, still much better than expected. And but how is this happening? How can this be possible? Well, there's a lot of give and take out there with landlords. People are working back and forth to basically arrange, sustainable pricing and so forth. And some tenants are actually putting rent on credit cards. So I thought John Pawlowski with Green Street basically put it well. Landlords and renters will share in the pain, but we don't know what the sharing balance is going to look like at this stage. And if we don't pull it together fairly quickly economically, we are going to arrive at some trouble spots coming forward. So as we think about credit card debt mounting, as we think about a lingering recovery, and then factor in the notion of unemployment benefits running out in July, and overlay that with the social unrest that we have, if we have a perfect storm of a lack of economic recovery and evictions arising out of the discontinued unemployment benefits, that could be a pretty ugly scenario, and it's one that we hope to avoid. Another interesting sort of thought question is Tier 1 metros. And so Washington, D.C. is a great example of, just an incredible renaissance of the downtown with very, very expensive housing within the urban core, such that many of the service population simply can't come anywhere near affording it. And, but nevertheless, it's been sort of a real story across the US, but we are seeing some sensitivity in these Tier 1 metros. Rents in the Bay Area, for example, are coming down. San Francisco had a 9% drop in year-over-year rents in May. Silicon Valley, 15% drop. So things are happening out there, and the pandemic may focus and change our personal preferences as consumers of housing. And then we really have to think about sort of the impacts of social unrest. It's very interesting to note that much of the protest activity has targeted some of the higher end neighborhoods in these metro areas. And it'll be interesting to see if that has a substantial or significant effect on consumer demand. So as we think about, putting this in perspective, you can see the incredibly precipitous drop in terms of the housing market index as reported by the National Association of Home Builders in April of this year. Certainly as we move into the future, on the left side of this graph, you can see the continued drop. And this is actually a different metric, but it tells the same story. This is single family permits. And again, you can see just the massive drop off in terms of where we are today. And then there could be a recovery coming into the summer of this year. And this is the flying W effectively, with the drop off perhaps in the fall, which is normal for real estate, especially residential. And by the way, there could be more viral behavior as the temperatures come down. But then the expectation is, because single family and certain aspects of multifamily were on a good track prior to the pandemic, there is a lot of pent-up demand, and we could see some significant bounce back as we move into the summer of next year. And beyond that, we do expect to see some perhaps shifts in demand in terms of geographic location. So as we think about millennials and we think about boomers, we have to, and we think about transit usage, we have to think about options. And we expect that there will be further consideration, and the data are beginning to bear this out, where city dwellers are really going to be looking at different options. But this also requires our suburbs and other perhaps corridors and other close-in locations to adapt and to provide more of the amenities that served these folks in their urban core locations previously. So we are very interested in tracking sort of the exodus, if you will, if it is a real trend. We think it is. And we're going to have a segment at the end of this presentation where we think about sort of these potential futures, these geographic futures in terms of where we might see shifts in investment. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to my colleague, Jason Moody, to take you through some of the office flex and retail and hospitality impacts.
Thank you, David. Very interesting discussion. I do want to know, though, if there's any, at this point, any comments or questions, or Jim, do you have any thoughts on the presentation information that David provided, or Sheila, have there been any questions we might want to address?
One, we haven't received any questions yet, so I encourage those of you out there watching this presentation, if you have questions, please submit them in the Q&A. We'd love to hear from you. Couple of things, you know, this whole issue around accommodations, around rents, things of this nature. One of the things that haven't been talked about too much is what is ultimately the impact on the banking system. And that was the core of the problem in the great financial crisis, obviously, with all the foreclosures. But, you know, mortgages on multifamily apartments could be coming under stress if the landlords aren't receiving rents. And the banks may have to make some accommodations and share some of that pain as well. There could be more defaults and foreclosures around that. And the idea that people are using credit cards to pay rent is very ominous. That's an unsustainable situation that are going to put a lot of people really deeply underwater and ultimately possibly cause some serious problems for people that are providing that credit card debt as well. I think the whole secondary city thing is really an interesting one because that's been happening already. A lot of millennials have gone off to you know, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and, you know, Atlanta and different places like that, away from the big coastal cities because they're more affordable. But, you know, jobs have been more movable than they have been in the past. But part of the reason that, you know, San Francisco and New York and Boston and places like this have been so popular is because people really like that urban culture. And if that becomes diminished because we have less vitality in that, and we have more mobility in terms of where people can work from, you may see an increase in that move towards secondary and tertiary cities where they can continue to work in the tech sector in particular and things of that nature, where location is less specific. And that might be an opportunity for, you know, additional renaissance in those places. But the implications for, you know, where the real core of that activity has been is probably, you know, diminishing.
I just like to make a couple of points, and that is I've done some work with a nationwide affordable housing developer, and rents in April and May were pretty consistent, but they're starting to see some fall off in June. And granted, we're just into June, but you know, rents are due the first of the month. So I think that sector right now, all the stimulus money is starting to wane a bit, and people are concerned and whether or not they're going to be able to keep up with those payments. Nonprofit sector here in the Phoenix area is doing a lot with food insecurity and making sure people have food. And if they have that, then they're much more likely to pay their rent. Recently, Arizona State University, Morrison Institute, and the Arizona Republic did a survey and asking people about their perceptions of the pandemic. And they asked some questions on housing. And the income sector that had missed payments on either rent or mortgages, the largest number was 35%, and that was people earning over $150,000. Lower income people are much more aware of how tenuous their housing situation is, and so they're very, very motivated, I think, to stay in that housing. I just wanted to share some local reflections.
We did get a question on the Q&A, and we should respond to that. Question is whether the season for home buying might actually extend further into the fall season because it's really been just put on hold the drop we've seen in single family sales and for sale homes generally is that people aren't showing homes and people are sheltering in place. So that kind of demand may express itself once those things are lifted. And the other reason that fall is slower is because people are back to school with their kids and they're in place for at least half of the year, if not the full school year. But if people are homeschooling now, that in fact might be another reason why that sales period could extend into the fall. And we will soon find out.
Okay, well, good discussion. I'm going to jump into the office flex section now. I'm going to start with a kind of a brief overview of what the sector or the office market looked like pre-pandemic. Kind of the recovery from what's commonly referred to as the GFC or the Great Financial Crisis. And generally speaking, while there has been some unevenness, there's been a pretty strong recovery with vacancy rates going down and absorption and new speculative development occurring. So when you have more tenants, less vacancy and higher prices, your loan to value ratios and your capitalization improves too. So I think going into this, property owners were in pretty good shape. There is some unevenness, however, between what we were calling the tier 1 metros and the more peripheral markets was starting to recalibrate that difference right when the pandemic hit. So we'll see how that happened, what the upside of all that is. But there was generally, the very strong markets in San Francisco and Boston and New York. And then you had other markets that were just now starting to pull themselves out and see some new development. And then this hit. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. You can go to the next slide. In terms of the office market, I think it's the general thought is that the office sector is maybe a little bit more insulated from this. And I think kind of for some pretty obvious reasons. The most primary one is that they're kind of on the right side of the digital divide, as we call it. It's easier. Most office tenants are technical. They can telecommute. They're not direct service providers. They don't need to interact with customers directly. They can do it by phone or Zoom. So there's a lot of things that in the office sector we can keep doing. We also tend to have higher salaries. We can sustain these temporary disruptions. And that strength in the office sector carries over to the landlord side of the equation too, where they can continue to potentially require that people pay their rents, even if they're not there, and that has been happening. And so, the landlords probably can limp through this as well, especially considering they're in such good shape coming into it. I think there will be some reset on lease terms, particularly to deal with the fact that a lot of tenants are going to have to invest in their office to reconfigure them to some degree. And also there's just going to be some that are struggling, and the landlords are going to have to acknowledge that the whole market is struggling. So if you kick out a tenant, you have to fill that space again. So there's going to be a natural need to come together there. But there will be opportunities, as always in these circumstances, for cash-rich investors to potentially look at distressed properties and make a purchase. There's obviously going to be differences by sector and by location, as there always is. I think the most vulnerable ones are going to be clearly the office sectors that are tied to the economic sectors that are going to be hurt, and that's energy and transportation, hospitality, fitness, and there's a lot of office services that go into that, whether it's marketing or design, development, real estate development, design firms I've been hearing are having some difficulty now because there's not a lot of new development going on. And then obviously the major CBDs that have had high, fast-growing COVID, and unfortunately those tend to intersect with the areas where there's been a lot of unrest of late. So those kind of combined effects are just kind of a double whammy right now. The well-positioned ones are maybe the suburban markets, which have had lower densities and also have had lower lease rates, may be a pretty good place for people to relocate certain functions going forward. And then the sectors that don't seem to be hurt as much would be things like life sciences and pharmaceuticals, insurance. Insurance is getting a lot of business these days because people are negotiating about a lot of claims. So that's happening. The tech sector, except for the startups, the tech sector, social media and whatnot, it's still going very strong. So those sectors that are tied to the office product tied to those sectors are also in better shape. You can go to the next slide. So in the last presentation, we talked a lot about the changing nature of work, and particularly how this pandemic has kind of created a beta test for these technologies that are allowing us to, many people who weren't even adopters, to work at home. And the question really was, will this create a sea change in terms of our willingness to allow workers to work at home, or just the productivity that's resulted has been pretty strong. And I think there is a natural tension here. We talked about that last time about the technologies and the capabilities to do that, and then there's just the natural social desire for interaction with colleagues and the productivity that comes with impromptu meetings and chance encounters and brainstorm sessions and the need for mentorship and all those things. And also just working at home forever you might feel like you're marginalized in the office, or that you're not being noticed, or whatever. So there are some kind of a tension here, not to say that that tension will ever be resolved, and it's fine to have that tension, but I think it is interesting too. We're talking a lot about short-term impact and longer-term impacts. And right now we're with the re-entry phase back into the office. So the short-term, we were all at home. And so that tension was resolved kind of by itself. Now we're kind of re-entering. And I think if you think about how we re-enter in the office market, it kind of shows how this short-term, long-term, that's really a theoretical construct. In reality, it's going to be an evolution, a change in the way in which we reorganize ourselves in the office. And I have this spectrum here of kind of the most basic, where you do the office modifications and the protocol required by CDC, for example. They just released some protocol that was pretty strict, 6 feet apart for each workstation, barriers and all these various things, face coverings, temperature checks, a whole host of things. So at the very minimum, a lot of offices will be definitely doing that type of stuff. And they'll, but then kind of next stage is to actually, create some work from home official guidelines, and allow more flexibility, and facilitate, buy everybody a laptop, make sure you're on the cloud, a bunch of simple things that, offices might do to make it life easier for people who want to work at home. The very far end, again, this is maybe some firms are already there and some may gravitate there, is really changing the whole culture of work. In cases where maybe the central office becomes more of the brand or cultural hub of your organization, but not necessarily the place where you go every day. It's kind of like a downtown. It's like where we go for the big events, for the team meetings and things, but you can spend a lot more time back at home. Or there's the worker rotation model where, people come in, it's a hoteling option. And finally, there's the notion that you have a continued suburbanization of the peripheral functions of your work to suburban markets where there may be space is cheaper, and you can have separate offices more easily. And if the rooftops are moving out there, then certainly that's a nice option. But this is a spectrum. It's going to evolve over time, and there's this natural tension that we talked about. You can go to the next slide. I think the question is from the perspective of how the effect is on the real estate demand for office. What will be the net impact of these two forces? So on the one hand, we know that people can work from home less, so you don't need potentially as much office space. But on the other hand, the people that are in the office might want more space, less density per worker. So we did a quick mock-up here just to show that in the end, in terms of the demand for office space, the type of space will definitely require, but the actual square footage may not. Here's a quick calculation just to show where you show square feet per employee going up, but the percent of the workforce going down that actually need a desk going down. So you look at those two different trends, and they both kind of move in a certain direction. The very bottom there, you have a high and low, which is basically 300 for a example here of 100 employees in an office. You really change your square feet demand from between 300 and 250 square feet. So That's not a huge change in the amount of space you need. It does change the location and type, but not the amount. That's kind of our thought on this. What's going to change the amount of space you need is that 100 employees. So if you start having to cut your workforce for whatever reason, that's going to change your amount of space, but not this work from home activity. So you can go to the next slide. We're moving quickly to retail and hospitality, but I wonder, before I do that, since it's a kind of a critical juncture, does anybody want to have anything to say about the office market?
We have a question that was submitted that we can chat about, and that is that, you know, with these productivity tools that we're all using these days, Zoom and others, if that is in fact enhancing productivity, what are the implications? You just answered some of this stuff already, Jason, in terms of, you know, the office utilization, but then there's questions about commuting, about airlines and business travel, and you know, residential location relative to work location. And one of the things I think that we haven't talked about too specifically that has potentially significant is work travel, because I know in our line of business, we do a lot of traveling around from market to market, even just to do presentations or have, you know, in-person meetings. And, you know, there's a lot of resistance. It's expensive and it takes a lot of time, and it's a kind of a hassle, although there's no replacement for, you know, face-to-face communication. But I think we are going to see, at least in the midterm to short term, a real pullback in business travel. I think this question of the office space, you know, it's, you know, your analysis is good, Jason. And I guess the question is whether or not people look at the bottom line of how much office space they're holding and think that they could really reduce that. And, you know, some of the adaptive things that you say would be incorporated, but there could be also an effort to relocate or scale back on some of that office development, I would think.
Okay, so that's a good transition actually into the retail hospitality, because it does relate to travel. It also does relate to the retail market, because the office set drive has been one of the big drivers of the downtown retail market. And in the last decade, office workers spend a lot of money, and the downtowns have essentially, downtown retail has essentially been shored up or repositioned from its old function as serving kind of, you know, basic needs and buying, you know, household appliances. That's no longer downtown at all. It's all about the dining and the entertainment sector. And when you have people leaving the office to work at home more, even if they're hoteling, there's just fewer people that are milling about in the downtown. That's going to be a big hit on the downtown retail. But I want to jump back and talk about pre-pandemic retail structure, and then jump into what the pandemic has done. Pre-pandemic, there was a lot of growth in retail, probably due to rising incomes, but there was significant structural change. There was this kind of tale of two situations. On the one hand, you had, you know, here you had between 2019 and 2020, you had significant growth just in sales. This is just sales. So going right into this pandemic, retail was really flying high from a sales perspective. But from a brick and mortar perspective, and even from a jobs perspective, you see on the left here, between 2018 and 2003, 31,000 jobs lost in the sector, 10,000 store closures in 2019 alone. And a lot of that was e-commerce taking into the, and also technology in retail, but e-commerce jumping in 17% of total sales and growing. And there's just this general thought that the U.S. is over-retailed anyway, because compared to European nations and other places, we're literally, you know, 10 times as high. So it is this sense that maybe we have too much retail in any case. So we can go to the next slide. So the pandemic, retail is really the eye of the storm here, because that is what's being hit more than anything. Social distancing has affected retail, different sectors in different ways, but, you know, and also the declining incomes then affects retail, and then consumer confidence is this circle. I think too, used to be retail shopping was kind of a fun thing to do. When I go to the grocery store now, I do not find it pleasurable at all. I mean, You see people with masks on, they're looking at you in a kind of paranoid way. It's not a fun experience. And so that kind of reduces consumer confidence as this kind of cyclical thing. So the pandemic has had a really hard hit on retail. As you can see on the left, just some basic, 5 million jobs lost, consumer spending down 25%. There haven't been numbers like this since, in fact, we've never recorded numbers like this because we weren't taking as good as statistics. So even the great financial crisis didn't see such an abrupt drop in the retail sector in terms of jobs and consumer confidence and things like that. You can go to the next slide. But there have been winners and there have been losers, no question about it. I think you can say that this weird temporary reversal of fortunes, if you will, where the experiential was really holding up the brick and mortar, and now it's the other way around. It's the essential goods and services, the things that people need, food, gas, household goods, and things like that, that is really jumping up. It's actually kind of winning now. And the discretionary goods have really taken a big climb. So the experiential retail was what we call experiential was holding up the brick and mortar, and now that rug has been pulled under, at least temporarily. And then on the other hand, e-commerce obviously has been a big winner. So and e-commerce was always a big winner, but in the last period of time, but they're doing strong. A virtually 20% estimate kind of overnight increase in e-commerce traffic. You can go to the next slide. So this might accelerate the shakeout in the retail, which we'd already seen happening. Looking here, you see 85% of retail establishments, 85% are small in the 1 to 19 size. So most establishments are small. The big ones, 3% are the big ones. This is in terms of number of establishments. And smaller retailers have a lot of problems. They have low cash reserves. They have minimal credit history. They have a transient workforce in general, which means when you lose your workers for a temporary closure, it might be hard to get them back. And the customer relationship is really important for these smaller retailers. They don't have the marketing and branding budgets that the big ones do. So they have to build it kind of one customer at a time. And that disappears, those customers may not come back. So the smaller, that could lead to a shakeout. You can go to the next slide. So there is this notion that the industry giants like Amazon and Walmart, they're actually doing pretty well. Now, if you compare that slide where the small was 80% of this slide is in terms of employees, 36 of the percent of employment is in that top 100. They represent 3% of the number of establishments. So it shows you how this sector is so bifurcated. And this gap could theoretically widen, which is certainly concerning for people who love the kind of boutique retailers and the creative ideas, and that brings spice to a neighborhood where you have the mom and pop that makes it interesting. So it's not a generic homogeneous place. So that's a concern for people like me who love downtowns and in these eclectic neighborhoods. You can go to the next slide. Just quickly on hospitality, they're facing a very similar circumstance, obviously. A huge precipitous drop. Someone quipped the other day that the hotel occupancies are now the vacancies of the past. So if you look at those numbers, basically they're reversed. Occupancies used to be 90%. Now occupancies, now vacancies are 90%. So it's just not a good situation. Obviously that's going to change, but it won't change overnight. Business travel is going to really kind of be tepid back into the market. Hopefully domestic tourism might help fill the gap, but and that's what we're hoping. And then, once people are more comfortable traveling again, it'll come back. But there was a fair amount of building in the hotel sector. You can go to the next slide. This slide is our attempt to kind of encapsulate all in terms of the real estate market effects from the hospitality and the pandemic on hospitality and retail. Now the top is the really high risk, and then the low risk is at the bottom. I would say that there's a time dimension here in the sense that, for example, tourist destinations or entertainment, that's a short-term effect. This is really a real estate perspective. It's a perspective on what the individual establishments and owners of property are looking at. Obviously, entertainment is not going to go away. It's not like we will never entertain again. So it's really going to reconfigure itself longer term. But in the short term, the owners of property are facing a really big issue. So, high risk, we have it broken down by category, by format, by location. I think in location, Smaller towns are maybe better off because they didn't have as much of a build-up anyway. So the retail sector is not so dependent upon experiential. They tend to have more basic needs in the smaller towns and so on from the suburbs up. We will talk about this again at the end. We can go to the next slide. So just to sum up, adaptation and reemergence of retail. E-commerce will continue to be a disruptive force in changing the landscape, for sure. There has been some issues. I don't think it's going to be as dominant as people think. I think there's some margin issues at the cost of delivering goods. You have to pay more for goods that's delivered because of that cost. It's cheaper to have all your customers come to you and buy your goods, obviously. And there's delay issues. There's been theft issues. You know, there's a whole host of things with the e-commerce that I think you see this big jump. I don't think there's still a lot to work out there. The brick and mortar is going to return with new formats, new amenities, and that's the big question, how and when. But ultimately, retail will follow rooftops and they'll follow workers. And if that happens to move to the suburbs, that's probably where retail will move. There will be pent-up demand, and the question is, how is that expressed? I think people's consumption patterns will change to some degree. I was thinking that one area is people are going to invest a lot more in their home. So home improvement, you know, people say, I'm spending so much time in my house now and I don't feel comfortable. I want a hot tub. I want to improve my porch. I want to improve my backyard, whatever. So those expenditures may go up. That may be where the pent-up demand manifests itself. We don't know for sure, but there will be a diversification of products, delivery, you know, the whole notion of how people pick up goods now and put them in their car. That's a lot. It's going to a lot change. One more slide here. And finally, I think there will be a need in retail for a conversion and a reuse of obsolete products, both hotel and retail, whether it's malls or hotels. Here's some interesting examples of hotels that have been converted to residential on the top, and then one on the bottom in Sacramento. It's a hotel actually converted to an office. So you may see more of this. Malls, obviously, we've been hearing a lot about them converting to fulfillment centers, distribution hubs, mixed-use communities. Even Google has taken over a mall in the LA area for its campus. So there's a lot of reuse opportunities for their malls. They're very centrally located and they have great access. So there's a lot of opportunities for these malls that may need to be reused. I think we can go to the next slide, and it's David.
Sure. Thank you, Jason. That was great.
And I just wanted to kind of real quickly on the adaptation side, talk about some of these may be temporary. For instance, our convention center here isn't being used, and so it's now become a respite place for people who are experiencing homelessness to go to during the day to get out of the heat. So I think we may see several iterations as opposed to going from one specific use to the next. Sorry, David.
That's right. Thank you, Sheila. So just to continue along the lines, and we'll come back to the retail transformation question and the implications of that in just a few moments when we have a discussion piece. But just to sort of lay the continuation between retail and industrial out, basically, the rise of Amazon and the transformation of our landscape with all the fulfillment centers is going to continue, and it's tracking with the retail trends Jason is discussing. So as we think about sort of the distribution functions, this is really going to continue to plug along. We're going to not see any radical shifts in terms of the way that the trends that we're moving toward in terms of retailing and how we fulfill those customers through our new e-commerce models. So that is, and I think most of us know this, really a major driving force in American warehouse and logistics development. And that's going to continue along, albeit potentially after some pullback. So as we think about industrial shockwaves and response, we are seeing a ripple effect from a softening of demand that could put the brakes on certain sort of industrial concepts. There may be a little bit of a pause for certain projects in certain markets. But so it's interesting to think about what happens in the longer term and how we respond to some of the very sort of acute and highly publicized breakdowns in supply chains that we've seen in many sectors related to the pandemic. And I think that here it is just really interesting to distinguish a bit between the notion of what's called onshoring our industrial product versus reshoring the industrial product. So the notion of reshoring is really redistributing this product across other countries, diversifying away from China, for example, into various other Asian countries that reduce the risk of trade imbalances and other concerns that we may have as we think about our Chinese relations. And then the notion of onshoring our industrial and logistics product is really one of coming to a decision of, are we willing to spend the extra money to put redundant systems in place? The just-in-time system and the globalization of our retail and logistics is something that is too powerful to go away. But we could see a judgment call on the margins in terms of a need to bring in certain functions back to our shores, just to simply not run the risk of being interrupted with medical supplies, for example, reagents in terms of testing kits, and many other examples of things that are really critical to have on hand. And maybe we've learned a lesson there, and we will see an uptick in terms of certain gateway market, kind of a coastal city, industrial uses, maybe in ports and other high value locations. So that is something to watch for. As we think about, so frontiers in the industrial world, I think of this reshoring and onshoring process as something that could have an effect when we think about our sort of strategic positions on the transportation grid. And many of our secondary and tertiary markets have a role to play in this regard. There is this notion of life sciences. For example, you can look in basically Vacaville, California, which is midway between UC Davis and UC Berkeley effectively, and that's why they located in their current position in the Central Valley of California. Gordon Moore, late Gordon Moore of Intel, he sort of made a statement late in his career that one of his wishes was that he had done more to put more facilities in the California Central Valley, more supportive chip building and other R&D support functions closer as part of an economic development approach. And maybe we need to think a little bit more creatively in the tech sector about utilizing the secondary and tertiary markets. And then finally, I think there's some serious crossover between the industrial outlook and the retail outlook. And this is sort of the hybrid or the intersect between them. I think if you've been to Granville Island in British Columbia, you've seen sort of a great kind of the hallmark example of experiential industrial. And so as we think about the great movement toward breweries and distilleries and bakeries and coffee roasting and all of these wonderful experiential sort of concepts, industrial in many cases is in a position to serve consumers in sort of a relaxed, low density, open air format. And so perhaps there is a future for adopting some of our industrial districts. And I think there's, for many of the sectors we've been talking about, there are applications that perhaps land in close-in corridors, or some of the adaptive reuse malls that Jason talked about, or perhaps smaller cities that are reinventing their downtowns and they're supporting industrial districts and so forth. So we're going to come back to sort of the outlook for that. And before we do that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim Musbach, and he'll take you through a brief recap of what we've just talked about and then launch us into our final discussion of the morning. So Jim.
Okay, thank you. This is a graphic that some of you who attended the last webinar will remember. And basically the direction of the arrow is, where we think things are going to be weaker or stronger, and then the size of the arrow kind of indicating the strength of that direction. And just this is a summary, really, of the things that we've been talking about. But single-family residential, of course, right now is just not much going on with that because construction has been stopped. Marketing and showing of homes and things like that. But we think overall it will continue to be a strong sector. There may be, with some of the mobility we've been talking about and work from home, that might add some demand to that. Multifamily, again, this is really tied in with kind of urban living and the preference for that type of thing. Right now it's kind of holding its own, although we showed earlier the steep declines in rents, but that may be just the fact that these are things that are coming open right in the middle of the pandemic. And so there's kind of a fire sale on some of those rents. And as long as the employment holds up and the lifestyle aspects of it hold up, we still see that as being a sector that has a lot of strength going forward. The office R&D flex, and particularly office, obviously, everybody's at home right now and we're seeing that go down. And there's going to be a slow kind of reopening, reentry, and adaptation about how that space is used. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about whether, the analysis Jason showed, for example, where you have kind of offsetting trends that wind up with very similar amounts of demand for space, or whether people will ultimately want to reduce their real estate footprint because of the cost of doing that is a bit of an open question, but obviously, it will continue to be an important part of all of our market areas. Central retail, it's going to continue to be strong. It always is. That's why Procter & Gamble's stock is always so strong. All the dish soap and everything else that we all need, food, and that will continue to be strong. Discretionary retail is really tied in with experiential activities, and it's not just shopping, it's conventions, it's sporting events, concerts, et cetera. That's obviously taken a huge hit, and we see it continuing to be weaker than it has been. I think the social dimensions of that, in terms of having gathering places where you have people from all different walks of life and income levels and ethnic backgrounds, is actually really important. And I think that people are going to want to return to those things, and we'll have to see how that works out. And again, as we talked about earlier in our last presentation, much of this depends on how we get through this pandemic and whether we have additional waves of this that are going to further undermine people's confidence in going out and mingling with other folks. Warehouse industrial, driven heavily by e-commerce, which continues to be very strong and likely will continue to be. People have gotten very used to using that, and it's kind of being used a lot for essential retail as it's not an experiential factor; it's a convenience factor. So I think we see that as continuing to be very strong. Hospitality, we don't know exactly how airlines are going to fare. They're all really in dire financial straits right now, and whether they're going to be able to provide lots of opportunities and cut rate fares and things like this, and make it convenient for people to get through security and health checks and things like that, where it makes sense to fly like we did before, will have a lot to do with how the hospitality market goes. Someone asked earlier about conversion of hotels, and right now in San Francisco, we've been seeing hotels being used for homeless housing, and some of them are maybe converted to residential over time, depending on how that sector fares. It's interesting to think about how these play out in different kinds of settings and urban areas and corridors. We think this, again, the kind of weakening of mom and pop and small scale retail is going to create opportunities for, scraping off some of the old strip centers and things like this, and probably replacing them with residential or other higher density uses. Downtowns and CBDs, the big question there is, can we get the kind of vitality back into the downtowns that people really have loved and thrived on or is this going to really have an impact over that long term? And to the extent that it does, you may see just, you know, a distribution of population going into smaller areas and more suburban locations and things of that nature. And some of this is, you know, the millennials are reaching an age where they're starting to want to have families and things like that. So some of the youth-oriented kind of activities that many of us enjoyed in our earlier days, you know, there's a certain demographic that will drive some of that change as well. Large-scale adaptive reuse, you know, underperforming malls, as Jason mentioned, are ripe for conversion, and you know, they're big facilities, have a lot of parking, so a lot of them won't be torn down. They'll be reused and repurposed in some ways. You know, someone actually mentioned about the reuse of, a question that someone submitted about the reuse of department stores. And we are already seeing that in downtown Oakland, for example. There was a 450,000 square foot Sears store that was taken over and adapted to high-tech use, and pretty much gutted out and completely changed in terms of how it's configured and how it's being used. So we'll see some of that. And it goes back even farther to the old Sears catalog distribution centers that are located, there's about 10 of them around the country. And they're huge facilities, kind of predating the fulfillment centers that we see now. And a lot of those are being reconverted into a kind of mixed use activities, you know, residential, commercial, institutional, things like that, which has been pretty exciting. Suburban environments, you know, they, I think, have the appeal that they've always had in terms of lifestyle and schools and things like that. And to the extent that our urban preferences change, we might even see further strengthening that, and also bolstered just by the demographics of the population as they move through different phases of their life. And I don't know, Sheila, if you have any comments or remarks you'd like to make? Or...
We did have one question come in regarding reinvestment in less affluent communities. And I think there is an opportunity there. I'm not sure, quite frankly, what we're going to see occur. I think there's a lot of history that's also playing out through social distrust in our communities all over the United States, at least. And I think that might have a factor about focusing on reinvestment in those communities. And I think there's an opportunity there that hasn't existed. I think we're kind of at the end of our time here. I think we've actually gone over a few minutes. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of the wonderful work EPS has done and shared with us today. And I want to thank everyone for attending. We'll be able to have the slides shared as we did with the last presentation. So you can find more information at lai.org. And once again, thank you so much for participating, and we hope to have additional webinars soon. So please stay tuned for upcoming announcements. Thank you again.
Thank you all.
Thank you.